Hello, welcome back. This is Dr. Steve Bonta, and we're on lecture 4 on the Indus script decipherment process. And as you can see, the title of this lecture is Segmentation of the Text, which means that we're going to look in more detail using the comparative method that we kind of laid out preliminarily in lecture 3 to see how the text how the text can be resolved into subfields and words and this kind of thing. So this is a very important topic. I would say that if this is the first such lecture you're listening to, at minimum you'll want to go back and listen to lecture 3 before you listen to this one. There are going to be a total of 10 lectures in this series at least, and they will be organized in such a manner that you have to kind of watch them in sequence. Otherwise, some of the claims that are made will make no sense because they'll be predicated on arguments made in earlier lectures. And so we've already laid out quite a bit of preliminary material in lecture 3. Lectures 1 and 2 can be profitably ignored if you're already familiar with the Indus script, if you're already familiar with the topic of decipherment in general, and with the linguistics of the South Asian area. So those are kind of introductory lectures for people who aren't familiar with those things. So lecture 3, the lecture preceding this one, is where, as they say, the rubber hits the road, and we begin the process of taking you through the decipherment, the partial decipherment of the Indus script that I've managed to achieve. So without further ado, let's talk about segmentation of the texts. Now, let's see here. There we go. Make this working right. So probably the most striking thing about many of the Indus texts that kind of will strike even the eye of the casual observer thumbing through the Mahadevan concordance or looking at a bunch of images of Indus inscriptions is what we mentioned already in lecture 3, the tendency of a certain series of signs that look like fish to cluster together. And those so-called fish sign clusters or fish sign subfields, it turns out, are part of a larger, very important recurrent pattern that I call the M field for reasons that will become apparent further on. But here in this first table, you see a very few examples of this extremely common sign field. And so you'll notice that the M field, here's an example of 3 fish signs, and then this sign that looks like an oval with a little branchy thing in the middle. Okay, this one is a smaller sign. It consists only of the 2 fish signs. Here's another example. They're underlined in red in each case. We have 2 signs that share the oval grapheme followed by 2 fish signs. Okay, you may recall from lesson 3 that this sign pair is actually a single compound sign, fish plus rake. And then here again, we have just fish plus 2 bars. Plus the oval sign again, similar to this one up here. You see that in MH 405. By the way, MH stands for Mahadevan. So from here on out, I'll be indicating inscriptions gleaned from the Mahadevan concordance with their index numbers. There may be some others from the ICIT from occasion later on. Okay. Then down here we see just a cluster of fish signs, and then one other sign that looks like a spear or an arrow or some such. Here's another example. Here's another example. Here's the first of many examples that could be adduced of a full M field, which consists of an oval type sign, a fish sign, and then this funny sign pairing here that it never varies in any way. It's just the first sign. Remember that the direction of writing is right to left. So the first sign looks like this little container with a stick stuck down the middle, a swizzle stick or some such thing, and then next to it 3 long vertical bars. And this part of the M field, when present, almost always occurs as the final element. Likewise, you see that same pattern here. First an oval sign, followed by 2 fish signs, followed by this invariant sign pair, and then some other signs after it. Okay, and just for the basis of comparison, and this is interesting, if you look over here in the right-hand column, you'll see that the segmentation of this first inscription at the top, MH4005, is clearly we have the diamond chevron plus double tick sign, this sign pair, which, as we noted again in lecture 3, we already talked about this very common sign pair, also occurs by itself. So the first segmentation we can make is right here. We can draw a line here. And then following this M field, we have these 4 signs, which is a very common pattern, and you'll see over here, here's an example of an inscription, MH1013. The etc. means that there are other such inscriptions, but we decline to list them all. It's quite a common inscription, a standalone inscription with these three signs, followed by the so-called jar sign, which is the commonest of all signs in the Harappan signary. Okay, so this means that in this first one here, we have one segment line right here that can divide this field from the fish field, and then another one here that kind of that demarcates or sort of lines off this M field. So whatever it means, it's sort of a unit unto itself, because then we know that this here is also has value of a full inscription. And likewise, in the second one, MH3120, by similar argumentation, line of argument, you can see that we have the fish sign cluster here, the M field, and then once again, this sequence of four signs that we know is kind of autonomous because we see it many times by itself. So we could segment this right here and say, well, whatever's going on and whatever they mean, we clearly have two different sign fields, at least, that are operative in this inscription. Now, here is another example. Here we have a preliminary sign. This time, instead of the diamond chevron sign, it's this thing that looks like a wheel, a spoked wheel. This is a very important sign also that we will have a lot to say about in future lectures. But you can see that it also occurs with the double tick sign right after it. So it's a reasonable supposition that this right here is sort of the same as this in some sense. They're both analogous sign fields. And then we have the M field underlined in red. And then we have this grouping of three signs, which, as you can see from the right-hand column, this is also a very common standalone sign sequence. So a secondary division or segmentation would occur right here. And again, we see the M field, whatever be its function, kind of stands by itself. And we can see the same thing happening here, except there's no double tick sign or anything to the right. It starts with an M field, and then once again, we see this very familiar sequence of three signs after that. I say familiar, if you spend a lot of time immersed in the Harappan corpus, you'll become familiar. You'll recognize certain of these inscriptions as being very common and occurring over and over again. So both of these sequences over here on the right are actually, all three of them are such. They're all three very, very common canonical sign sequences in their own right. Then down here, we see some examples of the M field. The only thing other than the M field is this rather enigmatic little sign that we'll have much more to say about later on. But for now, suffice it to say that it seems to be analogous in some way to the function of the jar sign. Anyway, so, and finally down here in the bottom, notice this is a very common sign sequence in and of itself, standing by itself, as we indicate here. The etc. in this case stands for, I disremember exactly how many, but they're like 15 or more instances of this sign sequence occurring and being an inscription by itself with nothing else. And then you can see over here a rather long, complicated M field followed by that same sequence. So again, we would posit that a segmentation line could be profitably drawn right here. Okay, so this is how we can compare and contrast different sign fields and can draw conclusions about the nature of the internal patterning of many of these inscriptions. Now, as I mentioned already, the M field itself has an internal structure. There are, as we mentioned here, there are three common canonical elements. There are a couple of other stray signs that occasionally are involved in this. There's a sign that looks like 12 little ticks that very occasionally seems to participate. Same thing. I'm going to let that go because it doesn't occur often enough. But suffice it to say, the three main canonical elements that you find most frequently in the M field are, first of all, the O subfield, as we're going to call it, because the three signs in it, this one, and this one, have as their common grapheme a sort of oval shape. And there are other signs, by the way, that also have an oval shape in it, but do not seem to participate in the M fields. And then the next week, we'll call it the F subfield, F for fish, of course, and it consists of 7 signs, up to 3 of these 7 signs, no more than 3. And they're also non-repeating, so they're not going to geminate ever. And here you can see what those signs are. And incidentally, there are several other signs that appear to be fish compounds in the Harappan signary, the Indus signary, but which do not occur in M field contexts. So we're going to let those go for now. And then finally, we have this invariant pair, which I mentioned already. Usually, not exclusively, but almost always, it is when it occurs, it will be the final element or leftmost element in an M field. Okay. Sometimes it occurs by itself, which we'll talk about later on. But this is the usual sequence right here, where again, going from right to left, we will start with an O subfield if present. Sometimes it's not present, and then the F subfield is next, and then finally this pair here. All right, and you can see some examples of that in this miniature table beneath. So here's the oval sign, 2 fish signs, 2 oval signs, 2 fish signs, 2 oval signs, 1. Whoops, sorry about that. Go back. Sorry, two oval signs, 1 fish sign, and then that invariant pair, okay? 2 oval signs, 1 fish sign, 2 oval signs, 1 fish sign, invariant pair, 1 oval sign, 2 fish signs, invariant pair. And this pattern repeats itself hundreds of times in the Indus corpus. So this is a very, very common and important pattern, and it's going to give us some interesting clues about what this what the content of many of these inscriptions actually is. All right, now, the first thing that we need to observe is that M fields must be some kind of notational writing. Remember, at the end of Lecture 3, we differentiated between notational and transcriptive writing. Notational writing in English is abbreviations, signs and symbols like mathematical signs, ampersands, abbreviations for dates, and things like this. So the reason we know this is that the patterning that we just observed in the M fields is very, very rigid. It's not random enough to correspond to ordinary words in language. Okay, and so this is something that's important to note. Now, I'm not the first investigator to make the observation that the patterns of occurrence of many of the Harappan signs are not random enough to correspond to syllables or letters or something like that. It doesn't seem there doesn't seem to be doesn't seem to be stochastic enough, in effect, to match the randomness of natural writing systems of language. The mistake that people who make that argument make is that they fail to recognize the fact that there's 2 types of writing. There are 2 types of writing, and they're kind of commingled here in many of these inscriptions. In the same way, as I illustrated in Lecture 3, we see this with English, where we have, I gave the example of a statement about mathematics, where you have, regular English words mixed in with mathematical symbols, the sort of language that we would see in a math textbook, for example. But we see the same thing with calendrics, with receipts, and records of transactions, and all kinds of other things. So the fact that M fields must be notational kind of means that we can narrow down their possible meaning to pretty much what we see down below. Okay, so titles, in English, Mr. and Mrs. and things like this. In Spanish, señor and señora, and this kind of thing is very common to abbreviate titles. So that's one possible context in which notational writing is used. Another is calendrics, meaning calendar dates. Another is addresses, meaning physical addresses of places. Okay, and obviously when we do this in English too, we have abbreviations for all of the states in the United States, for many of the countries in the world. USA, of course, is commonly used, or US instead of the United States. Street numbers will have numbers, and instead of saying street or avenue, we'll have ST period and AVE period and things like that. So addresses across languages are often, almost always, use some kind of notational writing. Then we have notations of either assets or transactions down here. And finally, we have numerals, per se, numbers. So let's look at which of these is the most likely. So first of all, let's look at the fish sign. Let's kind of back up a little bit and kind of assemble some clues about the meaning of the fish sign. So first of all, the basic fish grapheme, which we're showing here, is one of the 7 signs in the fish sign series. And because it is the underlying grapheme of all these signs, it sort of implies a certain iconicity in these signs, namely that whatever the shared meaning of these 7 signs that, remember, always co-occur, they're always adjacent in clusters of up to 3 within M fields. So whatever their purport, it's probably signalized by the meaning of this fish grapheme. Okay, just because iconically it makes sense. I mean, if there's a shared meaning, that would logically, iconically comport with the shared grapheme. Okay, so so that's what this is the very natural interpretation of this state of affairs. Note though that in other contexts, the fish grapheme is the only one of these 7 signs that occurs outside of these M fields as we've defined them. It in fact occurs in other contexts that suggest that it also has some kind of phonetic sense, and it's actually incorporated in the writing of words. And we'll get to that much later. That's not where we are right now, but we'll get to it later. But it also occurs in contexts alongside various stroke numerals, and I'll show this in the following slide. So here are a few of many, many contexts in which you can see the fish grapheme right here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and all through this list. And again, there are many other examples we could give if I had the visceral fortitude to assemble larger tables and assume that you had the patience to go through them all. But suffice it to say, this is a common pattern. So we see the fish sign by itself, co-occurring with various what have to be stroke numerals in these contexts, and you can see them, and so that kind of suggests that whatever the fish grapheme's meaning is in some contexts, it has something to do with numbers or something numerical. All right. So anyway, so this is what seems to be involved with the fish signs, in some sense. That. So now if we go on, let me make this work. There we go. So I'm going to suggest that the M fields are most likely metrological, and probably represent notations of assets or transactions. So there are a couple of things that bear mentioning in this connection. One of them is, and I've heard this before, people say, oh, well, but you're not going to see that sort of thing on seals. Well, we're just going where the evidence takes us. And other people have tried to force the fish signs to mean titles or something, which we address here in a minute. But as we'll talk about in later lectures, the Indus seals clearly were involved in transactions, commercial transactions, as evidenced by their use on seals and tags and so forth. And so the idea that they represent either assets, personal assets, against which, which are understood to be a pledge, an earnest, as they say, for a transaction, or perhaps represent donation to a temple or a deposit or something like that, does not seem as far-fetched as one might think. I'm going to talk a lot about that later on. I understand that some people who are familiar with sphragistics, which is the study of seals and their functions, are likely going to be repulsed at the notion that there could be anything related to assets or transactions on the seals, that the seals, whatever they have, whatever, are most likely just personal names, perhaps votive formulae, things like this. But I would point out that the seals are different in some respects from seals, say, from Mesopotamia. For example, Harappan seals are never found in funerary context. They're never buried with their owner. They're oftentimes found discarded, in effect. And so it would appear that they did not have any kind of necessarily, most of them, kind of sacred value or anything like that. I would also point out that that coinage as such, which originated many, many centuries after the end of the Harappan civilization, and indeed the Bronze Age as a whole, arose out of the use of seals. That early Lydian coins, the Lydians in Asia Minor, were, as far as we know, the inventors of coinage. And early coins issued by the Lydians were used as seals, as well as units of exchange. So, so this is not such a far-fetched idea as might be suspected. I don't have time to go into more about this, but Brian Wells in particular has written a lot about the context in which seals have been found. But what about the other possibilities? Well, calendrics is one that's been suggested more than once. But the problem with the idea of calendrics is that there's not enough regularity. In other words, we would expect a standardized template for day, week, month, year, or something like that. But M fields frequently do not display the full range of allowable subfields, and in fact sometimes only show one subfield, and that kind of thing. So it's hard to see how that could square with any conceivable calendric system. Okay, so that pretty much eliminates calendrics as a reasonable possibility. Now, as far as addresses are concerned, I met a young man many years ago in India who was investigating that possibility, that these actually were some sort of personal addresses, and meaning addresses where you live, okay? The problem with that is that there's no candidates for toponyms or individuated locales, and also similar patterns are found on artifacts from different sites in many cases. Now, there are some differences. I mean, there are differences between the inscriptions found in Harappa and in Mohenjo-Daro that I don't have time to get into right now, with certain signs that are found in one place and not the other. But in general, there is a surprising uniformity in the patterning of M fields, in the way that M fields are deployed in inscriptions from one site to another. Whereas if you would expect that if these represented like local addresses or something, that there would be some kind of local pattern that would indicate that. And so we don't really find those, and I don't think that addresses is really plausible either, given the brevity of those inscriptions. Addresses tend to require quite a bit of information as to street, district, and so forth. How about titles? Again, I mean, Parpola many years ago in a book, a really nice book that he published, I believe about 1990, about the Indus Valley writing, suggested that the fish signs, well, first of all, he's a Dravidianist, and so he assumed that the fish signs were corresponded to various Dravidian titles or, astronomical terms, and they represented, shining star, this sort of thing, but they were basically titles of royalty, if I remember correctly. The problem with that is that in a given language, there's only going to be a small subset of words that actually denote titles. Okay. So even if you have a very complex feudal society with a number of different ranks and so forth, you're still going to have at most only a dozen or maybe 24 words that correspond to different possible titles that men and women could bear. But here we have hundreds and hundreds of permutations, and very few of the M fields repeat, except in as much as they're embodied by a single sign. So again, the evidence for titles just does not seem possible. It doesn't make any sense that there could literally be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of different possible titles. Finally, numerals. Well, it's clear that these signs, as we've indicated, are associated with numerals. But we already have in the Indus sign inventory a significant number of stroke numerals, which I've alluded to kind of obliquely already in connection with the fish sign, as well as a series of curved lines that Brian Farmer, and I agree with him, believes also denote a series of numerals. So we kind of already have candidates for numerals. And once again, the patterning of it doesn't make sense for the patterning of numbers that the fish signs and the oval signs and the other the invariant sign pair that we talked about, that they somehow denote numbers. It seems pretty apparent to me that leaves the only likely possibility, the only likely candidate, as being some kind of metrological, meaning weights, measures, which would probably correspond to weights that would be indicators of value, of either of personal assets, of savings, of deposits, of exchange, of transactions, something like that. All right. But the sort of assets that are permanent enough that they're worth including on a seal, an item that could be carried around. So it doesn't denote some sort of a fleeting transaction, but something a little more permanent. We will have a lot more to say in future lectures, several lectures down the line, as to what concretely this may mean once some meaning starts to emerge from some of these inscriptions. But for now, we're going to adopt this as our hypothesis, that the M fields are most likely metrological. All right. So, and as part of that hypothesis, we're going to say that the O subfield and the F subfield probably represent two separate metrological series, meaning two separate series of weights, most likely, while the invariant pair that we have shown right here probably means something like the amount of, or exactly, or something like that. So it's probably a word that's associated with mensuration. All right. So here's the O subfield, and you'll note that these three signs, two of these three signs appear to be compounds involving two other common Indus signs. Now we're just getting into the Indus script, so you may not know that, but suffice it to say that there's a sign here that kind of looks like a triangle with tongs on it. This is a very common sign, and we will have much more to say about this sign later on, but in this case it appears to be conflated with the oval grapheme. And then this one here, which is called the staff sign by some, we're going to adopt that terminology, another very common sign and another critical sign going forward. But it appears to be sort of embedded within the oval. And also note, if you open the Mahadevan Concordance or look at the ICIT, you'll see that they typically list these two as separate signs because the interior looks slightly different, but it seems clear to me that these are allographs of the same sign. One of the problems, as I think I mentioned in one of the early lectures with the Indus inscriptions, is that they were never seriated as to time depth. And so, but they represent a pretty broad time period, at least 800 to 1,000 years, during which these inscriptions were being produced. And in that time, it's reasonable to assume that there was at least some change in the writing of some of the signs. So it could well be that these are not actually contemporaneous allographs, but this one maybe was the older version and this one was the newer version, but we have no way of knowing because of the way in which the excavations were carried out. 100 years ago, they weren't as fastidious about, about seriating things and taking notes at, what time depth they occurred and this sort of thing. So we don't have a lot of data as to which inscriptions are older and which are newer, and hence what appear in the signary as allographs may simply represent a single sign in different phases of development. Then we have the F subfield, as I mentioned already, the fish sign, which presumably represents a series of 7 related units of weight. All right, and I should say before we go on here, I'm not sure if I have a slide about this further on, but this is actually corroborated by the weights that are found next to the seals. Probably the next most common and interesting, archaeologically interesting thing that's found at Harappan sites are weights. And so we've been able to construct a series. This was done very early on by early investigators. We're able to construct what kind of what the weight series were, and the lowest series of weights was a series of 7 weights, and then the next higher series was a series of 3 weights. So that's an interesting possible coincidence, but it suggests the hypothesis, at least, that these 7 weights correspond to the 7 weights in the lower series, and these correspond to the 3 weights in the heavier series. And then there are other weights beyond that that are heavier and more significant. We will have more to say anon. Okay, let's see. Now let's move on to the staff sign. This is another critically important sign. And again, there are 2 different allographs, at least 2, that are shown, and both Mahadevan and the ICIT list them as separate signs. The ICIT actually lists like 3 or 4 different allographs as separate signs, but they all seem to be the same. And again, it's quite possible that they represent different stages in development of this same obviously important sign. All right. Now, owing to its graphology, we refer to this common sign as the staff sign because it looks like a staff of grain or a piece of grass or straw or something like this. And this sign appears to be another unit of measurement, again, presumably a weight, since like the fish sign, it occurs very frequently in conjunction with various stroke numerals. Note that Fairservice himself, Walter Fairservice, a great archaeologist, also regarded this sign as a likely dry measure. Okay, now we've already noted that this sign seems to be embedded in one of the 3 oval signs, so that is a significant fact in and of itself. But now look at this. Here's a small sampling of many, many inscriptions that have the staff sign left adjacent to or following various stroke numerals. And if you inspect this table, you'll see that there are a great many of them, and there are more than this, by the way. The significant thing here, perhaps, relevant to what we've been saying, is that it's very hard to, in this case, like M1220 and others like it, and M14411, etc., that inscriptions like this denote the name of a god, or a votive offering, or something like that, a votive prayer. It's clearly some sort of a notation of an amount of something, and yet this inscription occurs on a seal with a field figure, with an animal field figure. In other words, these inscriptions are not occurring in funny contexts like potsherds. Some of them, occasionally do. They're actually occurring on seals. And so if you look at this, the argument that the inscriptions on seals must be nothing but personal names, titles, perhaps votive prayers, and things like this, but can't possibly have notations of assets or transactions or anything like that, is falsified by these very many inscriptions that are in fact occurring on seals that in every other respect look like normal seals, except they have these funny little inscriptions that just kind of look like a stroke numeral and something else. Also notice that I think there's little doubt that these are stroke numerals because they're the variable. Right? We have this same sign. It's preceded by the 3, a 4, a 5, a 6, a 7, an 8, and so forth and so on down to this, and likewise the allograph over here. So to argue that, well, these must denote different words or something, it doesn't make sense at this point. So it seems apparent from inscriptions like this that yes, in fact, it is perfectly plausible that many of the inscriptions on seals did contain metrological information of some sort. I don't see any other rational interpretation of signs like this. And again, something like this is too brief to be a calendric or an address. Or something like that. So that, really doesn't leave any other option other than metrology. But I remember one time years ago, I was giving an address at Harvard University. A couple of people in the room just completely poo-pooed this idea because, we know that seals would just never have such things on them. But yet here's evidence from this sign. So, disagree with me if you will, but then what is your interpretation of inscriptions like this? So bearing in mind that this one here and this one here, MH2858, these are full and complete inscriptions. So what do they mean if they don't denote weights or measures of some sort? All right. And here's another thing that you see on the signs. This sign that looks like a container or a U plus certain stroke numerals appears to be another numerical or metrological field, albeit one of somewhat different purport, because it usually occurs on a separate line and oftentimes on a separate side of the seal. So it sometimes will occur like on the bottom edge or even on the back side of the seal, but it won't occur on the same side with the regular inscription. So it seems to be information about something different. And you'll have it, the U with certain long stroke numerals. We will have something more to say about this later on. For now, let me just show you a few examples of this. And notice that very occasionally, the fish grapheme and also this sign that looks like a man holding a bow, the Bowman sign, also occurs in those contexts. So here's some examples. Now, it's not really evident from this table, but what we actually hear is on one side of the object, the main face, we have this inscription here, MH4371. And then what's listed as line 2 is actually on a different face of the object. All right. So it seems to be denoting something that's pretty much apart from and extraneous to whatever is being denoted by this. And we see examples here, a bunch of them. I believe you don't normally see more than 4 long stroke numerals next to, maybe goes up to 5, but it's somewhat limited. So, but then we do occasionally see a fish thrown in there as well. And this is another little piece of evidence that the fish sign has some kind of numerical / metrological purport, because we do see it, not often, but we do see it occasionally in these type of contexts. Here and then here we see it in lieu of a stroke numeral. And then down here we see this curious thing with this Bowman sign, which is also and over here as well. So that's an interesting fact that will lead us to some interesting inferences later on. Okay, so this is kind of a quick overview of the subject of mensuration. Now, let's talk about the inscriptions writ large. Okay, there are broadly speaking, two types of inscriptions that we're dealing with, and I'm kind of adopting the terminology recommended by Brian Wells, they being patterned inscriptions and complex inscriptions. I mean, it may seem a little bit odd. All these inscriptions have patterns, of course. It's the nature of writing to have patterns. But in this case, pattern refers to the fact that the inscription is resolvable into several canonical sign fields, which include the M field already described. In fact, every inscription that includes an M field is ipso facto a patterned inscription. All right. But we also have a relatively small number, and by relatively small, I mean a few dozen fields that do not have any, inscriptions that do not have any discernible interior canonical sign fields. There's no M field, no fish signs, none of that stuff. And the signs in them are distributed rather more randomly. These we call complex inscriptions, and they look a lot more like normal writing in the sense that we understand it. So the example here at the bottom, which is only 5 signs, I can tell you now this is one of the most important of all the inscriptions in the corpus. We are going to furnish a full reading of this much later on, but this is extremely important. An extremely important inscription. Occurs in a very old weathered seal from Mohenjo-Daro, as you can see from the MH. Sorry, MH means Mohenjo-Daro, not Mahadevan. I said I spoke in error earlier. So these are Mohenjo-Daro Mohenjo-Daro inscriptions. Anyway, no, it is Mahadevan. Excuse me, it is Mahadevan, but this one happens to be from Mohenjo-Daro, and in fact, the bulk of these are. So anyway, but this is a very important inscription, and let's see. Here's some other examples of complex inscriptions. There it is again, MH 3105. And this one too, this is another one that we will be able to furnish a complete reading for, a very nice reading later on. This is MH 20, again, only four characters. But you look at these and kind of say, well, no, these kind of look like maybe names or titles or something like that. And that turns out to be the case, a preview of coming attractions. This one is another, these two at the bottom are very nice. This one, the reading is incomplete, but these two also we have complete readings of, and this one as well. So this one I do not have a reading of down here. So I'm using this as an example, but I can read several of the signs, but the overall inscription is still a mystery. And this is an important point to make, is that decipherment is a process. It's an iterative process. Across generations, and so what we're going to have here is important and revelatory and significant, and constitutes a very important breakthrough. But it's really just the beginning of the decipherment of this very difficult writing system. And so a lot of these inscriptions are only readable in part, or not at all. All right, so let's look at pattern inscriptions, kind of for the balance of this presentation. And so here's some pattern inscriptions, and they're segmented, meaning I kind of artificially put spaces between them. There are no such spaces in actual Harappan writing, okay? But this is for, these kinds of discontinuities are not found, but this is for convenience only. So these first two are full pattern inscriptions that show all 4 of the fields that we see. The P field, which is the rightmost field, the most, and that's the name that we give to the field that up until now we've seen manifest in the form of like the diamond chevron plus double tick, or the spoked wheel plus double tick. So that's called the P field. And then we have the M field, which we've already looked at. Okay. Then the next sign group that we call the C, I call the C field. It's just a term of convenience. And you can see some examples there and there and there. And then finally the T field, which more often than not consists of a single sign. Very frequently, this what's called the jar sign by many investigators, and the other one that looks like an arrow or a spear, you may remember from a previous table. And there are other examples besides. We're going to talk about those in more detail. But those 4 fields are the ones typically found in patterned inscriptions. This is a bit of an oversimplification because some of these fields are manifest in different ways, but we only have so much time to present this. But this is the typical pattern of pattern inscriptions that we see replicated hundreds and hundreds, indeed probably more than 1,000 times in the Harappan corpus. All right. So here are a few more examples. As you can see, in a couple of these cases, we see an M field and a T field only. We don't have anything else. Here we have the example of a P field and a C field, but there's no M field. And likewise here, no M field. So M fields are not ubiquitous, but we still would style these pattern inscriptions, even without an M field, because otherwise the patterning is very evident. All right. And here are yet more examples for your inspection. Notice here we have a very complicated P field, somewhat unusual, but not as uncommon as you might think. The majority of P fields are relatively brief, like this one here, and this one here. But sometimes other stuff gets thrown in that all-important position to the right of the little double tick sign. Here's another example of an extra sign in front of the diamond chevron sign. So it's not the norm, but we do find some P fields of considerable length and complexity, and this is one good example. All right, let's see. All right, so let's talk about the P field briefly. We'll go through all 4 of them. So this field is sequentially the first or rightmost field in pattern inscriptions. The P standing for prefix, although it's not understood to be a prefix in the grammatical sense of the word. I don't think these are prefixes for the record. It's just that they're in a prefix type position. They're prefixed to the rest of the inscription, hence the term. Okay, so that's where the P comes from. Anyway, it characteristically consists of 2 or more signs, the leftmost or final entry of which is ordinarily, almost always, one of 3 juncture signs. So there's a single tick, double tick, and then short tick plus long tick. So those are the 3 juncture signs. The double tick is by far the most common of the 3. The meaning of these 3 signs, these juncture signs, is not entirely clear, but they've been suggested to be case markers. I say neither yay nor nay to that. I think personally that there's a little bit more to it than that, but we're not going to get into that right now. These signs never occur anywhere but in P field final position, and therefore appear not to be transcriptive as far as the actual content of P fields is concerned. In other words, they seem to be kind of exiguous to the content of the P field. Many P fields consist of only one of a small set of common signs frequently found in this field, such as, now here are 2 you're already familiar with, the diamond chevron sign, the spoke wheel sign, but there are several others. This one here that looks like a thick X, this one we've seen already. In other contexts it also occurs. It looks like a tongs, sometimes called the tongs sign. And this one looks a bit like a crescent moon. And then this one kind of looks like a combination of these 2 signs here. And this one, which is the least common of the list, but common enough still to warrant inclusion, kind of looks like this one, and this one all glommed together. And so the fact that we already know that there are compound signs in the corpus should alert us to the possibility that some of these, whose graphology suggests they may be compounds, may in fact be compounds. Much more on this later on. Okay, but let's move on. So most of these signs may be found outside the P field. Well, I don't know about most of them. This one generally is not. This one is not. This one. Yeah, the other 5, these 5 generally are found outside the P field. And most of them may also be found in the P field in conjunction with other signs. We've seen that as well with the diamond chevron sign. Sometimes there are other signs right adjacent to or preceding that sign. Some P fields do not contain any of these signs. So we do occasionally find a P field, demarcated by a double tick leftmost, but the signs next to it none of these signs are included. We will see some examples of that. All right. Let's see, and most of them maybe, because they frequently occur alone with a juncture sign in a P field, these 7 signs presumably all have full word or word root value. Now again, how do we conclude this? Well, remember our arguments from lecture 3 concerning the diamond chevron sign plus the double tick sign, which occurs all by itself on many occasions. Well, from that we concluded that the diamond chevron sign must be a logograph. It must denote a full word of some kind, and moreover a word of some importance in the context that occurs because it's so frequent. Well, these other signs seem to form a functional set. They occur in complementary distribution with the diamond chevron sign. So we conclude that this sign also, whatever its meaning, must also be a logograph. And so with this one, and this one, and this one, and this one, and this one, they're all logographs. In other words, they all denote some kind of word. And presumably whatever it is they denote are some sort of a functional class. So if we can find out the meaning of one of these signs, at least in general, we can claim what the others are. But right now we don't know what that meaning is. All right, now the C field. This field will always occur third from the right, assuming the other fields are all present, following the P field and M field, where both of these fields are present. Where neither field is present, the C field will always be followed by, i.e., be right adjacent to, a T field. The ordering of signs within C fields is often quite random and reminiscent of complex inscriptions. Some common C fields, such as this one here, consist of only a single sign. All right. And then finally, the T field. This field often consists of only a single sign, such as the very common jar sign, this one here, and this one, we'll call it the arrow sign or the spear sign, whatever you want to call it. Although other signs like this one here, some people call this the bearer sign because it looks like an individual carrying a couple of weights on his shoulder, also occur in this context. They are ordinarily the leftmost or final entry in a patterned inscription, although certain other signs, such as these here, sometimes occur to the left of T signs. So there's some additional structure but it's peripheral enough that we're not going to deal with it right now at this level of analysis. These other signs appear to bear reference more to the content of the overall inscription than to signs like these two. Okay, so we don't regard them as part of the T field as such. And I would add that this sign here that looks like a comb is only found in inscriptions from Harappa. It's not found in inscriptions from Mohenjo-Daro. So that's another interesting fact. And it's not found ordinarily on seals, very occasionally on seals, but it's mostly found on little tiny tablets that don't have field figures. All right. So anyway, these two have been suggested by others to be case markers. I don't necessarily agree with that. In fact, further on in this study, we're going to see that actually there's ample grounds for believing that they're anything but case markers, something very distinct from that. But they're certainly apart from the content of the C fields and M fields that typically precede them. So much for T fields. All right. So now, finally, I believe this is our last slide. So the key to decipherment here, where we clearly have notational material mixed with transcriptive material, is which materials are notational, in other words, abbreviative in some way, and which are transcriptive, in other words, are in fact more or less faithful transcriptions of the underlying words that are meant to be conveyed. All right, well, from what we've seen, certainly the M fields are notational, and we're going to argue that T fields are as well. We'll kind of leave that aside for now, but T fields, because of their brevity and the extreme rigidity of their occurrence, the jar sign, for example, just never occurs. It occurs, it's the most frequently occurring of all signs, but it always, always, always occurs in the T context, except for a couple of instances of seals from the ancient Middle East, which probably denote some other language than the Indus language. Okay. But anyway, the M fields are really interesting because they're clearly notational, A, and B, they're very complex. Some M fields are very lengthy and have a lot of material in them. So M fields are potentially very interesting. And then the P fields, the C fields, and complex inscriptions in their entirety appear to constitute the material that we can assume is transcriptive, meaning writing in the sense that most people understand writing. So these three areas, these two major fields from pattern inscriptions plus complex inscriptions as a whole, is the real McCoy. This is the actual writing of words, and as such probably is what we need to focus on in some sense if we're going to make any progress with decipherment. The question is how. Okay, well, and actually before I end, So the question is, how do we leverage this fact into making an actual decipherment, or into making progress with decipherment? I'll give you a very quick preview of coming attractions. It turns out that our entering wedge is going to be those M fields and what they can tell us about weights and measures and certain very interesting facts about their graphology. That's what's going to allow us kind of a way into the decipherment, which I first perceived way back more than 20 years ago, but it took me a long time to figure out how to actually leverage it and make it work. So the balance of these lectures, and this is number 4, so we have 6 more coming at least, is going to lay out how we leverage the information that we've gleaned, that we've shown you in lectures 3 and 4 about the nature of these inscriptions and their content and certain relevant facts about the patterning of the signs into the beginnings of a decipherment. That's all for now, and we'll see you later in lecture 5.